The first time Damon Carter knocked on her door at midnight, Simone told herself it was just a neighbor situation. The second time, she told herself the same lie. By the third time, she'd stopped talking to herself altogether. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. And honestly, the fact that you chose to be here, out of every single corner of the internet you could have wandered into tonight, means everything. So thank you genuinely. Now, how is your day going? Drop it in the comments. Good, bad, chaotic, boring. I want to know. And if nobody has told you today, you have excellent taste. Subscribe, hit that bell, and let's get into this story because it is about to get very, very interesting. Simone Clark had not planned on opening her door that night. She was 32 years old, freshly divorced, newly relocated to a brownstone apartment on the quieter end of Harlem, and completely, deliberately done with men who made her pulse do anything other than stay calm and predictable. She had a glass of Malbec, a half-eaten bowl of pasta, and a documentary about unsolved art heists playing on her laptop. Her life was small and controlled in exactly the way she wanted it. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, confident, not aggressive, but not asking permission either. She sat still for a moment, fork halfway to her mouth, telling herself it was probably Mrs. Okafor from downstairs who occasionally knocked to complain about Simone's jazz playlist bleeding through the floor. Simone set her fork down, paused the documentary, and patted across the hardwood floor in her oversized Howard University sweatshirt and bare feet. She opened the door without checking the peephole, a habit she'd been meaning to break. And there he was, 6'2", maybe more, filling the doorframe the way men like him always did. Like they were used to taking up space and had stopped apologizing for it years ago. Dark skin, deep brown, smooth like the inside of a cacao pod. A jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who was showing off. He was wearing a black Henley pushed up at the sleeves, dark jeans, and the kind of calm expression that made Simone immediately suspicious, because no man knocked on a woman's door at midnight looking that unbothered unless he was hiding something or he was dangerous. Possibly both. Apartment 4B, he had. His voice was low, the kind of low that didn't need to be loud to land. Simone leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, chin slightly raised. Depends on who's asking. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. Almost. Damon Carter. I moved in next door this morning. He tilted his head toward apartment 4A. My electricity is out, breaker won't reset. I saw your light under the door. She stared at him for exactly 3 seconds longer than was polite. You moved in today and already blew a breaker? I had a lot of equipment. What kind of equipment? That almost smile again. The kind that requires a lot of power. Simone blinked. She was not going to read into that. She was absolutely not going to read into that. There's a maintenance number on the board downstairs, she said. It's midnight. That's generally when people are asleep, yes. You're not asleep. She opened her mouth, closed it. He had a point, and she resented him for it. She looked him over once more. The kind of look a woman gives when she's trying to decide if a man is a threat or a temptation, knowing full well those two things are not always different. He held her gaze without flinching, without smiling, without doing anything except standing there looking like every complicated decision she'd ever made had somehow taken human form and moved in next door. Come in, she said, stepping back. Flashlight's in the kitchen drawer. She felt him before she heard his footsteps, a warmth that preceded him, something understated and unsettling, like the air pressure shifting before a storm. He stepped into her apartment and looked around once. Not nosily, just observant. And she noticed his eyes were the kind of dark that held things. Stories. Weight. She handed him the flashlight and pointed toward the hallway. Breaker panels in these buildings are usually in the utility closet. Yours should be identical to mine, just mirrored. He took the flashlight from her hand. His fingers didn't brush hers, not even close, and yet Simone felt it like a current anyway, and that annoyed her more than anything else that had happened that evening. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't make a habit of it, she replied. He looked at her then. Really looked at her like he was reading something written in small print behind her eyes. No promises, he said. And then he was gone, back into the dark hallway, leaving Simone standing in her own kitchen holding nothing but the memory of a voice that sat too comfortably in her chest. She poured herself another glass of wine. She did not go back to the documentary. She sat on the couch and listened, without meaning to, for the sound of his electricity coming back on. When it did, a faint hum through the shared wall 12 minutes later. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Curious. God help her, she was curious. Simone told herself she wasn't watching for him. She was wrong. 3 days had passed since the midnight knock, and in those 3 days, Damon Carter had managed to occupy more space in her mind than he had any right to. Considering she barely knew the man's last name and had spent a combined total of maybe 8 minutes in his presence. 8 minutes. She'd spent longer waiting for her coffee to brew, and yet somehow this man had taken up residence in the back of her thoughts, like he'd signed a lease and paid first and last month's rent. It was irritating, deeply personally irritating. She was a structural engineer. She built things that held weight. She understood load-bearing walls and tension points and the precise moment a structure went from stable to compromised. She did not get rattled by a jawline and a low voice and eyes that held too many secrets. Except apparently, she did. She was standing at her kitchen window with her morning coffee. Just standing, not watching. When she saw him come out of the building's side entrance at 6:45 in the morning. Black joggers, gray-fitted t-shirt, earbuds in, moving like a man who ran not for fitness but for something else entirely. Like he was outrunning a thought or a memory. His stride was long and deliberate, and even from 3 floors up, Simone could see the controlled tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set just a little too tight for a casual morning run. Something was sitting on that man. Something heavy. She stepped back from the window before he could look up, then immediately felt ridiculous for stepping back, then felt more ridiculous for feeling ridiculous. She was a grown woman. A divorced, independent, mortgage-understanding, load calculation-running grown woman. She could stand at her own window. She stayed away from the window. The second time she saw him that day, it was the elevator. She was coming back from a site visit, still in her work clothes. Tailored charcoal trousers, a white silk blouse with the top 2 buttons open because it had been a long, sweaty, concrete and deadline kind of day. Hair pulled up in a bun that had started elegant and ended somewhere in the neighborhood of exhausted. She was carrying a rolled tube of blueprints under one arm and her laptop bag on the other shoulder and mentally drafting an email she did not want to write. The elevator doors opened and there he was. Damon Carter. In a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who weren't trying to impress anyone. Naturally, effortlessly, like the suit had simply decided to behave. No tie, top button undone, a faint shadow of stubble along his jaw that hadn't been there 3 days ago. And something in his expression that flickered for just a half second when he saw her. Something warm that he tucked away almost immediately, like he'd shown too much and caught himself. Simone stepped in. The elevator doors closed. It was a small elevator. Old building, old elevator, the kind that moved at a thoughtful pace and forced proximity in a way that felt almost intentional. She could smell him. Something clean and dark, like cedar wood, and something underneath it she couldn't name but felt in the base of her sternum. "Long day?" he said. "Is it that obvious?" "The blueprints are upside down." She looked down. They were. She flipped them with as much dignity as she could locate and stared straight at the elevator doors. "I knew that." "Sure you did." She cut her eyes at him sideways. He was looking at the doors too, but his mouth was doing that thing again. That almost smile that wasn't quite a smile but was worse than one because it suggested he found her genuinely entertaining, and for some reason that made her stomach do something embarrassing. "What do you do?" she asked. Because she was curious. Because she'd been curious for 3 days and pretending otherwise was exhausting. A beat of silence, just long enough to be intentional. "Consulting," he said. "Consulting." She let the word sit. That's what people say when they don't want to answer the question. He turned his head and looked at her then, fully, and up close his eyes were even more unsettling. Dark and still and intelligent, the kind of eyes that gathered information quietly, cataloged it, filed it away. The kind of eyes that had seen things. "Security consulting," he said. "Private clients." What kind of private clients need a consultant who moves into a Harlem brownstone with so much equipment he blows a breaker on the first night? Something shifted in his face, subtle, a tightening around the eyes that lasted less than a second before the calm returned. Careful clients, he said simply. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. They both stepped out, walked the short hallway side by side without speaking. He stopped at 4A, she stopped at 4B. She dug her keys out and could feel him standing there, not rushing, not walking away yet, and the awareness of him was so physical it was almost unreasonable. "Simone," she said without turning around, "in case you forgot?" "I didn't forget," he said quietly. She got her door open, stepped inside, and only when the door was closed behind her did she lean against it, eyes on the ceiling, pressing her lips together and breathing slowly because her heart was doing something loud and unnecessary and completely against her will. Through the wall, that thin, shared, traitorous wall, she heard his door close too. Then silence. Then, faintly, the low murmur of a voice, his voice, tense, controlled, the kind of tone men used when they were on a call they didn't want overheard. Simone set her blueprints down very carefully. She was not going to press her ear to the wall. She pressed her ear to the wall. She caught fragments. Not enough. "Not yet. I told you to wait. If they move before I'm ready, everything falls apart." And then a long silence, and then lower, in a register that made the hair on her arms rise slowly. "Nobody touches her. You understand me? Nobody." Simone pulled back from the wall. Her mouth was dry. Her pulse was not calm or predictable. Her new next-door neighbor, with his cedarwood scent and his careful eyes and his almost smiles, was involved in something that required security, silence, and apparently someone being kept safe. The question that kept her awake until past 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling with her wine untouched on the nightstand, was simple and terrifying, and she didn't want to ask it but couldn't stop herself. Was she the her he was talking about? Simone had a rule about men who made her nervous. She avoided them. It was a clean rule, a logical rule, a rule born from 3 years of marriage to a man who had made her nervous in all the wrong ways. Charming in public, cold behind closed doors, the kind of man who knew exactly how to make a woman feel chosen until the day he made her feel invisible. She had packed 2 suitcases, signed the divorce papers without drama, and moved to Harlem with a deliberate, quiet resolution. No more men who unsettled her. No more situations she couldn't engineer her way out of. Damon Carter was already breaking that rule, and he hadn't even tried. That was the part that frightened her most. She didn't see him for 4 days after the elevator. 4 days of silence from apartment 4A, save for the occasional low movement through the walls. Footsteps, the muffled sound of a television she never heard laugh tracks from, the 6:45 a.m. run that she was absolutely not timing from her kitchen window. 4 days of telling herself she wasn't curious, wasn't unsettled, wasn't replaying the fragment of phone conversation she had no business having heard in the first place. Nobody touches her. Those 2 words had taken permanent residence in her chest, and she resented them deeply. On the 5th day, her building's water main broke. It announced itself at 7 in the morning with a sound like... The building was clearing its throat dramatically, followed by a complete loss of water pressure to the entire 4th floor. Simone stood in her bathroom with a toothbrush in her hand and absolutely nothing coming from the faucet, staring at her own reflection with the specific expression of a woman who had already had enough of the universe's sense of humor. She was still standing there when she heard the knock. Not 3 sharp raps this time, 2. Quieter, almost like he wasn't sure. She opened the door. Damon was standing there in a plain white t-shirt and gray sweats, hair not yet neat, jaw carrying a full day's worth of stubble, holding 2 large bottles of water like a peace offering from a man who wasn't sure if there was a war, but was preparing just in case. In the unguarded light of early morning, without the suit or the controlled expression or the careful distance, he looked different, less like a threat, more like a person, a tired one, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. Something in Simone softened before she gave it permission to. "Water's out on the whole floor," he said. "Thought you might need these." She looked at the bottles, looked at him. "You knocked on my door to give me water. You knocked on yours to give me a flashlight. She took the bottles. That was different. How? She didn't have an answer for that. She stepped back. You want coffee? I have enough water left in the kettle. It was impulsive. She knew it was impulsive even as the words left her mouth. But he nodded once and stepped inside, and Simone told herself this was just two neighbors being civilized and not anything that required her pulse to behave the way it was currently behaving. She made coffee. He sat at her kitchen counter on a bar stool, both hands wrapped around the mug she slid to him, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke, and the silence was the kind that should have been uncomfortable, but wasn't. It was warm, lived in, the kind of silence that only happened between people who were somehow, inexplicably, already at ease with each other despite every logical reason not to be. She leaned against the opposite counter, mug in hand, and looked at him directly. Are you going to tell me what you're actually doing here? He met her gaze. I told you. Security consulting. Damon. His name felt strange and familiar at once in her mouth, like a word she'd known in another language. I heard your phone call. Through the wall. I wasn't trying to, but these walls are thin and you weren't quiet. Something moved behind his eyes. Caution, calculation. And then, slowly, something that looked almost like relief, like a man who was tired of carrying a story alone. How much did you hear? He asked. Enough to know you're not just consulting. He set his mug down, looked at his hands for a moment, then looked up at her with those still, dark eyes and said, There's a man, powerful. Federal connections, private money, the kind of man who operates in spaces most people don't know exist. He was connected to a woman I was hired to protect 18 months ago. He paused. She didn't make it. The kitchen went very quiet. I've been building a case against him since, quietly, carefully. His jaw tightened. He knows someone is getting close. He doesn't know it's me yet, but his people have been watching this building for the last 2 weeks. Simone felt the cold move through her slowly, deliberately, like it was taking its time. Watching this building, she repeated. Our building. Yes. And you moved in next door to make sure nobody in this building became collateral, he said. Especially not. He stopped, caught himself. Simone set her mug down very carefully. Especially not me. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He just held her gaze with an expression that said everything his mouth wasn't saying, and Simone felt the full weight of it land on her chest like a structural beam. Heavy, load-bearing. Impossible to ignore. You've been watching me, she said quietly. Not an accusation, almost a question. I've been watching out for you, he said. And the distinction in his voice was so deliberate, so careful, that it did something to her she wasn't prepared for. She should have been angry. Part of her was. But there was another part. The part that had pressed her ear to the wall, that had timed his morning runs without admitting it, that had felt his absence for 4 days like a room with the furniture rearranged. That part was doing something far more complicated than anger. She pushed off the counter and walked to the window, needing distance, needing to put something between herself and the way he was looking at her. Below, Harlem was waking up. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, a woman pushing a stroller, the ordinary, beautiful noise of a neighborhood that didn't know anything dangerous was living on its 4th floor. How long? She asked. Until it's over. And if it's not over before? She stopped, turned to face him. Before someone decides that watching the building isn't enough? He stood then, and she hadn't fully calculated what it meant to have him standing in her kitchen, in her space, close enough that she could see the exact place where his collarbone disappeared beneath the white cotton of his shirt, close enough to catch that cedarwood warmth again, close enough that everything calm and deliberate in her was quietly, dangerously dissolving. Then I handle it, he said, simply, absolutely, like it was already decided. You handle it, she repeated, and she heard the edge in her own voice. Not quite anger, not quite fear, something that lived between the two and tasted like the moment before lightning. Damon, I don't need a man to... I know you don't need one, he said, voice dropping lower, and the shift in register went through her like a chord change. Slow and resonant and felt in places she had no business feeling things. That's not what this is. Then what is it? He was close. She hadn't tracked the step that closed the distance, but it had happened, and now there were maybe 18 inches between her back and the window, and less than that between her and him, and his eyes were doing that thing. that reading the small print thing. And her heart was loud and completely unmanageable, and she was absolutely certain he could feel it too, because the air between them had gone thick and electric and still. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, and somehow that was more dangerous than any answer he could have given. Her phone rang. They both blinked. The spell, or whatever it was, she was not calling it a spell, cracked at the edges. She reached for it without looking away from him. Unknown number. She answered, if only because she needed something to do with her hands and her voice and all the electricity she had nowhere to put. Silence on the line. Then a man's voice, smooth and cold as marble. "Miss Clark, lovely building you live in. Be a shame if something happened to it." The call ended. Simone lowered the phone slowly. When she looked up, Damon's expression had changed completely. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was something harder, sharper, controlled in the way of a man who had been trained to take dangerous situations and reduce them to manageable variables. He already knew. She could see it on his face. "That was him," she said. "Yes." She breathed once, slowly. "So it's already too late for me to be uninvolved." "Yes," he said again, and this time the word carried weight that settled around them both like the walls of a room that had just gotten much, much smaller. She looked at this man, this complicated, dangerous, cedarwood-scented man who had moved in next door with secrets and water bottles and eyes that saw too much, and made a decision that the structural engineer in her knew was a risk she hadn't fully calculated. "Then tell me everything," she said. There are moments in a person's life that divide cleanly into before and after. Simone would later mark this as one of them. The morning the water went out, the morning a stranger's cold voice came through her phone like a threat wrapped in silk, the morning Damon Carter sat back down at her kitchen counter and began dismantling every wall between them, one quiet word at a time. She refilled both mugs, not because she wanted more coffee, because she needed something to do with her hands while her world rearranged itself. His name was Victor Hale. 54 years old, former federal prosecutor turned private sector, the kind of career pivot that looked clean on paper and wasn't. He ran a consulting firm, the legitimate face of something much darker, with offices in 3 cities and the kind of quiet influence that never made headlines because men like Victor Hale understood that visibility was a vulnerability. 18 months ago, a woman named Diane Osei had hired Damon to protect her. She was a forensic accountant who had stumbled onto a financial trail buried inside one of Hale's shell companies. Money that connected powerful people to things that powerful people paid a great deal to keep buried. She had been careful, methodical. She had trusted the right people, she thought. She had been wrong. Damon's voice stayed even as he told it, but Simone watched his hands around the mug. The slight tightening of his fingers, the stillness that wasn't peace, and understood that whatever controlled surface he was presenting, underneath it was something unhealed and driving him forward with the quiet ferocity of a man who had decided to trade grief for purpose. "She was killed in a car accident," he said. "Officially. The kind of accident that has no witnesses and a clean police report and a file that closes in 2 weeks. But you don't believe it was an accident." "I know it wasn't." He looked up. "Because the night before she told me she'd found something bigger than the money. She wouldn't tell me what over the phone. She said she'd show me in the morning." He paused. There was no morning. The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Simone said. And she meant it in the full, weighted way. Not the reflexive sorry people offered like a tissue, but the kind that acknowledged that some losses carved out spaces that didn't fill back in. He nodded once, accepting it without deflecting it, which told her more about him than anything else he'd said. "I've spent 18 months building what Diane was building," he said. Quietly, carefully. "I have names, transactions, connections. I'm 3 weeks away from handing everything to the one federal contact. I trust enough not to be in Hale's pocket." He met her eyes. 3 weeks, Simone. That's all I need. And Hale knows someone is close. He knows. He doesn't know it's me yet, but his people identified this building 2 weeks ago because I made one error. A meeting in a coffee shop 4 blocks from here that I thought was clean. His jaw tightened. It wasn't. Simone wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at him steadily. "So when his man called me just now, He's sending a message. He doesn't know what you know. He's trying to destabilize me by showing me he can reach the people around me. Something dark and controlled moved through his expression. He underestimates how seriously I take that. The way he said it. Low, absolute, with a quiet fury underneath the calm. Did something to the air in the room. Simone felt it against her skin like a change in temperature. This was not a man making a statement. This was a man making a promise. She studied him for a long moment. The engineer in her was running calculations. Risk assessment, load-bearing, structural integrity. The woman in her was doing something else entirely, and she was doing her best to manage it. "What do you need from me?" she asked. He looked at her carefully. "Nothing. I need you to go about your normal life, not change your routine, not do anything that signals to his people that you know anything." "And you'll do what? Sit next door and monitor things?" "Yes. Alone. That's generally how I work." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's generally how people get killed, Damon." Something shifted in his face, a fraction of surprise quickly managed, like he hadn't expected her to push back and wasn't entirely unhappy about it. "I'm not asking you to be involved in... I'm already involved." She set her mug down with a quiet finality. "That man called my phone. He knows my name. The line between involved and uninvolved got crossed before you finished your coffee." She held his gaze. "So either you let me help in whatever way makes sense, or I spend the next 3 weeks being a liability you're managing alone instead of an asset you're working with. Your choice." The silence that followed was long enough to be meaningful. Damon looked at her. Really looked, the way he'd done in the elevator, that careful, reading every word look. And she held it without flinching because she was not a woman who looked away from things that mattered. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something between observation and wonder, said quietly, like it surprised him in a way he was still processing. "I'm terrified," she said honestly, "but I'm a structural engineer. I don't walk away from something just because it has the potential to come down. I figure out how to keep it standing." Something in his face changed in a way she felt in her chest, slow, like a door opening that had been closed a long time. It wasn't the almost smile. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. Appreciation, recognition, the particular look a person gave when they saw something in someone else they hadn't expected to find and weren't sure what to do with. "3 rules," he said finally. "Tell me. You don't move on anything without telling me first. You don't approach anyone connected to this, and if I tell you to go, to leave the building, leave the city, whatever I tell you, you go. No argument." She considered it. "I'll agree to the first 2. Simone? If you're in danger, Damon, I'm not running. So don't include that in the agreement because I won't honor it, and we'd be starting this partnership on a lie." She tilted her head. "I'll stay out of the way. I'll be smart, but I won't abandon someone who..." She stopped, caught herself on the edge of something she hadn't meant to say. He waited. "Who knocked on my door at midnight with water bottles," she finished, more quietly than she'd intended. The air between them shifted. That current again. That slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore current that had been building since the first night and was now considerably less subtle. He was looking at her mouth. She caught it, the brief involuntary drop of his gaze, and the immediate controlled return to her eyes, and the awareness of it moved through her like warm water. She cleared her throat. "So, 3 weeks." 3 weeks, he confirmed. His voice was slightly lower than it had been, slightly rougher, like something in him had slipped a fraction and he was deciding whether to retrieve it. "Then we should probably know more about each other than a flashlight exchange and a coffee," she said. "If we're going to be convincing neighbors." "We are convincing neighbors. Convincing enough that his people watching this building don't look twice." She stood, carried her mug to the sink, and felt him watching her the whole time the way you felt sunlight. Not seen, but warmly, undeniably present. She turned around. "Have dinner with me tonight. Here, normal. 2 neighbors, boring domestic scene, nothing to report. A beat." "That's actually smart," he said. "I know." She allowed herself a small smile. "I'm a structural engineer, Damon. I build things that don't fall down. Start trusting that." He stood then, picked up his mug and carried it to the sink himself, stopping beside her to set it down. and the proximity was sudden and close and loaded. His arm nearly brushing hers, that cedarwood warmth wrapping around her thoughts like something she'd been breathing all her life and only just noticed. He was close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, barely an inch, pale against dark skin. Close enough that when he turned his head to look at her, the distance between them was nothing. Was breath. Was the specific charged silence of two people standing at the edge of something they both recognized, and neither was ready to name. 7 o'clock, she said, and her voice was impressively steady, considering what her body was doing. 7 o'clock, he agreed. He left. She stood at the sink for a full minute after his door closed, one hand pressed flat against the cool counter, reminding herself of the rules. Her rules, the ones she'd made after Marcus, the ones about men who made her nervous, the ones that existed for excellent, proven, deeply personal reasons. Then she picked up her phone and called her best friend Kezia. Kezia answered on the second ring. "It is 7 in the morning, Simone. I did something." A pause. "How bad?" "I invited my next-door neighbor, who is 6'2" and involved in something dangerous and smells like cedarwood, to dinner." A longer pause. "How fine?" "Kezia, on a scale of 1 to call your mother, don't." "Girl." Kezia's voice dropped to the specific register of a woman who had known Simone Clark for 15 years and understood every version of her. "How long has it been since you let someone in that door?" Simone looked at the door. "He's a security consultant." "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Harlem's morning continued. Unhurried, unbothered, unaware of the dangerous, warm, complicated thing that was quietly taking root on the 4th floor. "Too long," she said finally. "It's been too long. Just a quick note. We already completed part 4 in the previous response. You're actually ready for part 5 now. I'll go ahead and write part 5 for you right now, following all your instructions." She changed her outfit 3 times. Simone was not a woman who changed her outfit 3 times. She was a woman who decided, committed, and moved forward. In work, in life, in the particular architecture of her daily choices. Indecision was not a personality trait she recognized in herself. And yet there she was, standing in front of her open closet at 6:15 with 2 rejected options on the bed behind her and a third in her hands, having a quiet, undignified argument with herself about what a person wore to a dinner that was supposed to look like nothing while feeling like everything. She settled on a deep burgundy wrap dress that hit just below the knee. Simple, elegant, the kind of thing she'd wear to a work dinner. Except she paired it with bare feet because it was her apartment and she was not trying to impress anyone. She was running a cover story, and bare feet said casual neighbor dinner far more convincingly than heels. She told herself that 4 times. She was on her 4th time telling herself when the knock came at exactly 7 o'clock, and she registered. Despite everything. That he was a man who arrived when he said he would, not 7:03, not 6:58, 7, exactly. She found that unbearably attractive and immediately resented it. She opened the door, and the sight of him hit her the way it always did. That half-second of recalibration, like her system needed a moment to adjust to the specific reality of Damon Carter standing in her doorway. He was wearing a deep navy shirt, open at the collar, dark trousers, no jacket. He'd shaved the stubble to a close, clean line along his jaw. He was holding a bottle of red wine in one hand and looking at her with those careful dark eyes. And for a moment, just a thin, suspended moment, neither of them said anything. His gaze moved over her once, quick, controlled, but she caught it, the same way she'd caught it that morning, and the awareness of being seen by him. Really seen, not glanced at. Settled warm and low in her stomach. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said pleasantly, stepping back to let him in. "We're neighbors having dinner. Keep it boring." "I was going to say you look like you've been cooking. There's flour on your collarbone." She looked down. There was, in fact, a small dusting of flour on her collarbone from the cornbread she'd made from scratch, because apparently she'd lost her mind completely. She brushed it away with as much dignity as the situation allowed. "Come in," she said. His mouth did the thing. The almost smile. She was beginning to hate that almost smile in the way you hated a song you couldn't stop hearing. With a frustration that was entirely indistinguishable from pleasure. She had made jerk salmon, roasted vegetables, and the aforementioned cornbread. The real kind, her grandmother's recipe, the kind that required actual effort and meant something. She hadn't cooked like this in over a year. She'd been telling herself it was because cooking for one felt pointless. Standing at the stove that afternoon, music low, the kitchen filling with the warm bite of spices and the smell of browning butter, she'd understood it was something else. She'd stopped cooking because she'd stopped wanting to make something that deserved to be shared. That thought had unsettled her so thoroughly that she'd burned the first batch of cornbread and had to start over. She didn't tell him any of that. She plated everything cleanly, poured the wine he'd brought. A Cabernet that was better than anything she had in her cabinet, because of course it was. And they sat across from each other at her small dining table, with Harlem's evening light coming through the windows in long amber strips. He took the first bite of salmon and went quiet in a way that was completely different from his other silences. "My grandmother's spice blend," she said, watching him. "It's extraordinary," he said. And the simplicity of it, the lack of performance, the way he said it like he was just reporting what was true. It did something to her that 100 elaborate compliments wouldn't have. "She was a better engineer than I'll ever be," Simone said. "Except she built flavors instead of buildings." He looked up. "Tell me about her." So she did. And then, because that's how real conversation worked when it finally started between two people who had been circling each other, he told her something back. About his mother in Atlanta who still called every Sunday and pretended not to worry. About growing up wanting to be an architect of all things. About the particular strange parallel between his work and hers. She kept structures standing, he kept people standing. And somewhere in the middle of that observation, they both went quiet for a moment in the specific way of people who have just discovered an unexpected point of recognition. The wine went down slowly. The food disappeared. The amber light softened to the blue-gray of a Harlem evening, and Simone got up to turn on the lamp. And when she turned back, he was watching her with an expression that was open in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Unguarded, unhurried, the careful control still present but sitting differently. Like a man who had decided, at least for the length of this dinner, to put the weight down. It made him look younger, more human, more dangerous in an entirely different way. She sat back down, closer than before, angled toward him, the table between them feeling smaller than its actual dimensions. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask. Was there someone before Diane, before all of this? Was there someone you were doing this kind of work for? Someone who made it personal the first time?" The silence was different from his other ones, heavier. She watched him decide something. "My younger brother," he said. "Terrell. He was 19. Got tangled up with people he didn't understand because he was trying to make money fast and impress a girl." A pause. "The people he got involved with decided he knew too much. He didn't, but they couldn't risk it." Another pause. "He was 20 when they decided that." The air left the room quietly. "I'm sorry," Simone said, the full, weighted kind again. "I became what I am because I couldn't protect him," Damon said. "I've spent 15 years making sure I can protect everyone else." He looked at her steadily. "That's not a heroic story. I want you to understand that. It's a grief story that found a useful direction." She looked at this man, this honest, complicated, cedarwood and grief man, and felt something inside her shift with a slow tectonic certainty that she recognized as the feeling of something important changing. Not falling, changing. The way a building settled into its foundation, the way load redistributed when a structure found its true balance. "Damon," she said quietly. "Simone." His voice when he said her name was a specific thing, low, deliberate, like he was being careful with it. "I need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "I am not Diane. I am not your brother. I am not a person you need to carry." She paused. "But I would like very much to be someone you don't have to carry this alone with, if you'll allow that." Something moved across his face. Slow, deep. A wave that started somewhere behind his eyes and traveled through the whole of his expression. He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers on the stem of her wine glass, and the contact was simple and warm and electric all at once. His thumb moving once, slowly, across her knuckles like punctuation, like a period at the end of a sentence they'd been writing since the first knock. Neither of them moved. The city hummed outside. A saxophone somewhere in the street below drifted up through the window, low and aching and perfectly, absurdly timed. Simone was aware of everything. The warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his gaze, the way the space between their chairs had become the most charged geography she'd ever occupied. "You should know," he said, voice dropping to that lower register that lived in her sternum, "that this isn't something I do." "What isn't?" "This." His thumb moved again across her knuckles. "Slow. Intentional. Sitting in someone's light and telling them things I don't tell people." Her breath was not as steady as she'd like. "Why are you telling me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you have the specific quality," he said, "of making dishonesty feel like more effort than it's worth." She almost laughed, and then she almost did something else entirely because he was leaning fractionally closer and his eyes had dropped to her mouth again, and this time he didn't immediately look back up, and the air between them was thick and warm and smelled like wine and cedarwood, and the specific, breathtaking tension of two people on the edge of a moment they couldn't untake. Her phone buzzed on the counter. They both stilled. She pulled her hand back slowly. Not fast, not startled, slowly, and reached for the phone. A text from an unknown number, 3 words. "Enjoy your dinner." The warmth in the room went cold at the edges. Damon was already standing, the easy, open expression gone, replaced by something precise and alert. He moved to her window in 2 strides, standing to the side of it the way trained people did, visible to no one, seeing everything. He looked down at the street below, and whatever he saw made his jaw set in a hard, controlled line. "There's a car," he said. "Black SUV. It's been there since 6. Simone stood. "They were watching us have dinner." "They were watching me." He turned from the window. "Which means they've confirmed I'm connected to you now." His voice was level, but she could hear what it was costing him to keep it that way. "I'm sorry. I should have..." "Don't." She crossed the room and stood in front of him, and she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze from this distance, which was considerably less than any distance they'd maintained all evening. "Don't apologize for dinner. Don't apologize for tonight." She held his eyes. "But tell me honestly, are we safe right now?" He looked at her face, close and steady. "Right now," he said. "Yes." "Then we finish the wine," she said. "And tomorrow we figure out how to end this 3 weeks early." He stared at her for a moment that stretched and breathed and pulled. Then, finally, fully, for the first time, he smiled, not the almost, the real one. And it was devastating in the quiet, complete way of things that had been withheld and then given, reshaping everything in the room with its sudden, uncomplicated warmth. "You are," he said softly, "the most unexpected woman." "I know," said Simone Clark, and she went to pour the wine. "There are things that happen slowly, and things that happen all at once. What happened on the 7th night after that dinner happened both ways simultaneously. Slowly, in the way that everything between Simone and Damon had been building since the first knock, and all at once, in the way that danger never gave you the courtesy of a warning you were actually prepared for. She would remember it in pieces afterward, the rain, the sound of breaking glass, the particular quality of his voice when everything calm in him finally, completely ran out. But she was getting ahead of herself. The week after the dinner had been its own particular kind of beautiful torture. They had settled into something. A rhythm that had no name and didn't need one, the kind that developed between 2 people who were smart enough to know what was happening and stubborn enough not to say it out loud yet. Morning coffee through the shared wall. She would knock twice when it was ready, and he would appear at her door within 4 minutes, which told her he was already awake and waiting in a way she chose not to examine too closely. Evening check-ins that started as tactical briefings about the black SUV and the movements of Hale's people and ended as 2-hour conversations that ranged from structural engineering principles to Atlanta childhoods to the specific philosophical problem of whether a person could ever fully outrun their own grief. She was beginning to think the answer was no. She was beginning to think the better question was whether you could find someone worth standing still with. He touched her with restraint that was its own form of intimacy. a hand at the small of her back when they passed in the narrow hallway, fingers brushing hers when he handed back her mug. Once. Just once. He had reached up and tucked a loose lock behind her ear with a gentleness so deliberate, so careful, that she had stopped breathing for the full 3 seconds it lasted and said nothing for a full minute after. He'd said nothing either. They had both simply continued the conversation as though the room hadn't shifted 4 degrees on its axis. The tension between them had become a living thing, present and patient and growing. Kezia called every other day. "Has he kissed you yet?" "We are in the middle of a dangerous situation, Kezia." "That's a no. Girl, dangerous situations are exactly when people kiss. Have you learned nothing from every movie ever made?" Simone had hung up. She'd thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The rain started on a Thursday evening, the heavy Harlem kind that came in off the river and meant business. Drumming against the windows, turning the street below into rivers of reflected streetlight. Simone was at her drafting table working late on a bridge consultation, glasses on, hair loose, a forgotten cup of tea going cold beside her laptop when she heard it. Not through the wall this time. A sound from the hallway, sharp, controlled, the specific sound of someone moving fast and quietly who knew exactly how to move fast and quietly. Then Damon's door, opening and closing in under a second. Then nothing. She was at her own door before the rational part of her brain could arrange a counter-argument. She opened it to an empty hallway. But the stairwell door at the end was just settling closed, the way it did when someone had just gone through it in a hurry. She should have gone back inside. She went to the stairwell. The building's stairwell was old and echo-prone, which meant she heard the voices before she saw anything. 2 of them, low and tense, from the floor below. She descended carefully, silently, the structural engineer in her noting every creaking board to avoid. She saw them through the stairwell's half-glass door. Damon. And a man she didn't recognize. Heavy-set, expensive coat, the kind of stillness that didn't come from calmness but from threat. They were standing in the 3rd floor landing, and even from where she was, even through the glass, she could read the geometry of the confrontation. The way Damon had positioned himself, body angled, weight distributed, hands visible and open, the trained stillness of a man who was a moment away from needing to move. "Hale says you've got 2 days, the man said. "Walk away from what you're building, or the woman on the 4th floor has a very unfortunate accident." Everything in Simone went cold and still. Damon's response was quiet. She couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the register. Low, controlled, carrying the specific weight of a man who was choosing very carefully how much of himself to show. Whatever he said made the other man's posture shift slightly, not backing down, but recalibrating. 2 days, Carter, the man said, and walked away toward the building's back exit. Simone was already 3 steps back up the stairwell when the door opened behind her. "Simone." She stopped, turned. Damon was standing at the base of the stairs looking up at her, rain damp from whatever he'd been doing before this, jaw tight, eyes doing the thing where they held everything and showed nothing except, right now, in this moment, something that looked very much like fear. Not for himself. She understood instinctively that Damon Carter did not carry much fear for himself. "How much did you hear?" he said. "Enough." She came down the stairs until she was 1 step above him, which put them nearly eye level, the closest they'd stood since the night of the dinner. "They threatened me." "Yes." "To get to you." "Yes." "Which means," she said slowly, "that whatever you have on Hale is significant enough that threatening me, a woman he believes is just your neighbor, is worth the risk of exposure." Damon looked at her. "You're processing danger like a structural assessment." "It's how I don't panic." She held his gaze. "How close are you to having enough?" "Days. I'm days away." His voice was taut. "But if he moves against you before..." "He won't." "Simone." "He won't," she said again firmer, "because we are not going to give him the time." She stepped down to his level. "What do you need to finish this? What's the one piece you're still missing?" He studied her face for a long moment in the stairwell's poor yellow light, the rain loud against the building's exterior, the space between them charged and close and smelling of damp and cedarwood and the particular electricity of a moment where everything was on the line. "There's a server," he said. "Off-site, a private data facility in Midtown that Hale uses for his personal files. I've had the address for 6 weeks, but I needed a second person. Someone with technical access credentials to get inside the building legitimately. He paused. It's a consulting firm on the 3rd floor that doesn't know who owns the server room below them. I've been trying to arrange access through channels that would take another 2 weeks. Simone was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I have a client in that building, she said. The stairwell went very still. Structural consultation, she continued. I've had security clearance for that building for 3 months. I have legitimate documented access to every floor for infrastructure assessment. She watched his face process it, including the basement. Damon stared at her. I know, she said. Simone, this is not a structural walkthrough, she said. Tomorrow, you come as my assistant. We have every reason to be there. We access the server room during the building inspection. You get what you need. And we walk out with everything Hale has been trying to bury for 18 months. She paused. It's not reckless. It's load-bearing. It's the move that holds everything else up. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her the night she said, "Tell me everything." With that specific expression of a man who had been doing something alone for so long that the presence of genuine partnership felt almost unfamiliar. Almost too much. If something goes wrong, he started. Then we handle it together, she said. That was always going to be the answer, Damon. You just needed to get there. The rain hammered the building. The yellow light flickered once, and in the narrow, closed charge space of that stairwell, with danger sitting 2 floors below and 3 weeks of slow-building heat sitting between them like a held breath, Damon Carter reached out and took her face in both hands. His palms were warm against her jaw, his thumbs rested at her cheekbones, and he held her face the way you held something you were terrified of dropping. Firmly, carefully, with the full attention of a man who had decided that being careful and being present were not the same thing anymore. He looked at her for one long, breathless moment. If anything happens to you, he said, and his voice was rough at the edges in a way she'd never heard from him before, the control fraying just enough to show what was underneath. Raw and honest and deep. Nothing is going to happen to me, she whispered. I need you to mean that. I mean it. And then he kissed her. Not urgently, not hungrily. That would come later. She knew it the way you knew weather. This was the first kiss of a man who had been holding something back with both hands for weeks and had finally, quietly put it down. Slow and certain and devastating in its completeness. His lips warm and deliberate against hers, tasting of coffee and the particular flavor of something long decided. Her hands found the front of his shirt and held on, not pulling, just holding. Anchoring herself to the reality of this moment in this stairwell, in this rain-loud building. He kissed her like she was something worth being careful with. She kissed him back like she agreed. When they separated, it was slowly, reluctantly, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, both of them breathing differently than they had been, the yellow light making everything amber and close and suspended. Tomorrow, she said softly. Her voice was not entirely steady. She didn't try to make it so. Tomorrow, he said. His thumbs traced once along her cheekbones. Slow, like he was memorizing something. Then he stepped back, and she breathed. They went back upstairs in silence, side by side in the narrow hallway, and stopped at their respective doors. She could feel the changed quality of everything. The air, the space, the particular weight of what had just shifted between them in a stairwell while it rained. She opened her door, paused. Damon. He looked at her. When this is over, she said quietly, I'm going to need you to finish that kiss somewhere that isn't a fluorescent lit stairwell. A beat of pure, warm silence. Noted, he said, and the real smile came again. The full one. The devastating one. And he stepped inside his apartment and closed the door. Simone stood in her own doorway for a moment, hand on the frame, heart doing something loud and completely ungovernable in her chest. Then she went inside, sat on her couch in the dark, pressed both hands to her face, and said, out loud, to no one, Oh, I am in so much trouble. From the other side of the wall. That thin, shared, irreplaceable wall. She could have sworn she heard, very faintly, the low, warm sound of him laughing. She wore the charcoal trousers and the white silk blouse. The same ones from the elevator, the ones that said structural engineer on a professional site visit with complete documented legitimacy. She stood in front of her mirror at 7 in the morning and looked at herself steadily. The woman who had moved to Harlem to be small and controlled and done with things that unsettled her, and almost laughed at how thoroughly that plan had collapsed. Not fallen. Collapsed. The specific engineering term for when a structure didn't gradually weaken but gave way all at once under a load it hadn't accounted for. Damon Carter had been a load she hadn't accounted for. She picked up her site bag, her credentials, her laptop. She rolled her blueprint tube. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to look like. A professional on a routine consultation. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. Her heart was doing something loud and complicated that she had decided, for the purposes of today, to simply let do what it needed to do. She was done managing it. The knock came at 7:15. 2 knocks. His. She opened the door. He was wearing a dark gray button-down and black trousers, a visitor lanyard already around his neck with credentials she didn't ask how he'd arranged. He was carrying a slim black case that looked like an architectural sample case and absolutely wasn't. His eyes moved over her once. That quick, controlled sweep she had come to know like a language. And something in them settled warmly in a way that had nothing to do with the mission. "Ready?" he said. "Born ready," she said. "Don't make it weird." The almost smile. Wouldn't dream of it. The building in Midtown was 40 stories of glass and steel, and the particular self-importance of corporate architecture that had prioritized aesthetics over load distribution. Something Simone had noted in her original consultation report, and something she noted again now as they walked through the lobby side by side, her credentials presented at the front desk with the easy confidence of a woman who had done this 100 times because she had. Clark Structural, 3rd floor infrastructure assessment and basement utility inspection. She slid her documentation across the desk. "My associate, Mr. Carter." The security guard checked them both, issued badges, waved them through. That was the easy part. The elevator down to the basement was small and slow and reminded her uncomfortably of their building's elevator and the first time they'd stood this close in a moving box and said things that weren't about what they were about. She could feel him beside her. That warmth, that steadiness. And underneath the focused, professional calm he was carrying today, she could feel something else too. The same thing she was carrying. The awareness that after today, everything changed. Either they walked out of this building with everything they needed and Victor Hale's operation came apart at the seams, or something went wrong in the last 7 weeks. The flashlight, the coffee, the cornbread, the stairwell, the kiss became a story that ended badly. She didn't allow that thought to stay. "Second door on the left once we're in the utility corridor," he said quietly, eyes forward. "I need 12 minutes at the server. 11 if everything connects cleanly. I'll be running a legitimate pipe assessment in the adjacent room. If anyone comes down, they'll see exactly what they're supposed to see. If anyone comes down who isn't building staff..." "I know." She didn't look at him. "Damon." "Yeah. We're going to be fine." A pause. "You keep saying that." "Because one of us has to." The elevator opened to the basement corridor. Gray concrete, fluorescent lights, the hum of building systems doing their quiet, essential work. She felt him shift beside her into something sharper, more alert, and she matched it in her own way. Clipboard out, pen in hand, walking with the specific, purposeful stride of a woman who belonged exactly where she was. They reached the server room door. He produced a key card she definitely didn't ask about. The door opened. 12 minutes, she said. 11, he said, and went inside. She worked. That was the honest truth of it. She actually worked because standing in a basement corridor pretending to assess pipes while her whole body was tuned to the sound of the server room door and the corridor behind her required something to do with her hands, and her professional mind was the best available option. She measured. She noted. She documented load-bearing wall placements with genuine attention because the building did actually have 2 points of structural concern she'd been meaning to flag. At minute 7, she heard the elevator. Her pen kept moving. Her body stayed relaxed. Her mind went completely, surgically alert. The elevator opened. Footsteps. 2 sets, coming down the corridor with the specific unhurried confidence of people who weren't building staff and weren't pretending to be. She turned around before they reached her. 2 men, dark coats, the particular blankness of hired professionals. The one on the left she recognized, the heavy-set man from the stairwell. Hale's man. His eyes moved from her face to the server room door and back, and the calculation in them was cold and fast. "Miss Clark," he said. "Funny place for a site inspection." "Funny place for a social call," she said pleasantly. He took a step forward. "I think you should step away from that door." "I think," she said, clipboard pressed to her chest, voice absolutely even, "that you're trespassing in a restricted building area, and I have full documentation of my authorized presence here, which means any interference with my work constitutes obstruction of a licensed professional consultation, which is a matter I'd be delighted to take up with building security and then, if necessary, with the city." She tilted her head. "Would you like me to make that call now, or would you prefer to leave the way you came?" The man stared at her. She stared back. She had in her professional life stared down city inspectors, contractor disputes, a particularly aggressive project manager in 2019 who had made 3 grown men cry in one meeting, and her ex-husband's divorce attorney. She was not going to be moved by a man in an expensive coat in a basement. 9 seconds of silence. The server room door opened. Damon stepped out, black case in hand, and took in the scene in approximately 1 second. His eyes went to Simone first, checking her, cataloging her, confirming she was unharmed. And the relief that moved through his expression lasted less than a breath before it hardened into something else entirely as he looked at Hale's man. "Marcus," Damon said, quietly, like a door closing. The man called Marcus looked at the case in Damon's hand and understood immediately what had just happened, what had just ended. She watched it move across his face. The calculation, the assessment, the arrival at the conclusion that the play was over. "Hale's not going to let this stand," Marcus said. "Hale," Damon said, "is going to be considerably busy in about 48 hours. He pulled out his phone with his free hand. "And you have about 30 seconds to decide whether you want to be standing next to him when that happens, or whether you'd like to have a very productive conversation with my federal contact tonight. Your choice." "I'd make it quickly." The corridor was very quiet. Marcus looked at Damon, looked at Simone, looked at the case. He made his choice. She didn't fully breathe until they were back on the street. Midtown noise hit them like a wave. Cabs and construction and the indifferent, beautiful chaos of New York doing what New York did. And Simone stopped on the sidewalk, tipped her head back, and took one long, slow breath of cold city air that tasted like exhaust and freedom. Damon stopped beside her. She could feel him looking at her. "You told him it was obstruction of a licensed professional consultation," he said. "It was. Simone, he had a weapon. I was aware of the weapon. And you just stood there, with your clipboard. It was a very authoritative clipboard." She lowered her head and looked at him and found him looking at her with that expression. The open one, the unguarded one, the one that did things to the structural integrity of her composure. "Did you get everything?" "Everything." He held up the case slightly. 18 months. It's all here." She nodded. And then, because the adrenaline was finally fully metabolizing and her hands were starting to do the shaking they'd been waiting politely to do, she pressed both palms flat against his chest, just to feel something solid, just for a moment. His hand came up and covered both of hers, warm, steady, present. "Hey," he said softly. "I'm fine," she said. "Give me 10 seconds. He gave her 10 seconds. He gave her all of them without moving, without speaking, one hand over hers and his heartbeat under her palms. Faster than his exterior suggested, which somehow made everything better. He was human under the control. She'd known it, but feeling it was different. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She looked up at him on a midtown sidewalk in the cold October light, blueprint tube under her arm and adrenaline in her blood, and the full knowledge that the man standing in front of her had moved into her building on purpose and stayed because of something that had started as duty and become something neither of them had planned for, and both of them had arrived at anyway, the way you arrived at the truest things. Not in a straight line, but inevitably. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." He made the call to his federal contact that evening from her couch. She sat across the room at her drafting table pretending to work and listening to the quiet, controlled efficiency of a man handing over 18 months of his life in a 40-minute phone call. When it was over, he sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, looking at nothing, and she understood that look. The particular stillness of a person who had been running toward something for so long that the moment of arrival didn't feel like she'd expected. It felt like standing at the edge of something. The grief of Terrell, the guilt of Diane, the long, heavy forward motion of a man who had turned a loss into purpose and now had to figure out who he was when the purpose was complete. She got up, went to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of wine, came back and set one in his hand and sat beside him on the couch. Close, shoulder touching his, not making anything of it, simply being present in the way she'd asked him to let her be from the beginning. He looked at the glass, then at her. "It's done," he said, like he was still deciding if he believed it. "It's done," she said. Diane would know that. Something moved through him. She felt it in the shoulder pressed to hers. A long, slow release, like a structure finally, fully settling into its foundation after being held in temporary supports for too long. He leaned his head back against the couch. She leaned hers back too. The lamp was low and warm. Outside, Harlem moved through its evening. Saxophone somewhere, a child laughing, the city doing what cities did, living loud and unbothered and beautiful. "What do you do now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," he said. And it was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. "First time in 15 years I don't have an answer to that question." "That's terrifying." "Yes. Also kind of wonderful." He turned his head to look at her. She turned hers. They were close. Couch close, shoulder close, the kind of close that had been building for 7 weeks and had nowhere left to defer to. "I remember," he said softly. Something about finishing a kiss somewhere that wasn't a fluorescent-lit stairwell. She felt the smile start somewhere deep before it reached her face. "I believe I said that, yes. I've been thinking about it." "How often?" "Constantly." No hesitation. Honest and quiet and devastating. In a way that was genuinely inconvenient given the circumstances. "And now?" she asked. Her voice was softer than she'd planned. "Now the circumstances," he said, "are considerably more favorable." He set his wine glass down on the coffee table, took hers and set it down too, and turned to her fully, one arm going to the back of the couch behind her, his body angling toward hers in the warm, lamp-lit room, and she felt the shift in the air the same way she'd felt it in the elevator and the stairwell and every charged space they'd ever occupied together, except without the interruptions, without the danger, without anything left to defer to. Just this. Just them. He brought his hand to her face the same way he had in the stairwell. Both palms warm against her jaw, thumbs at her cheekbones. Except this time there was no rain, no urgency, no fear pressing at the edges. This time it was slow and certain and chosen, and he looked at her for a long, full moment in the way of a man who had learned the hard way not to take moments for granted. "Simone," he said. Just her name, low and certain and full. "Damon," she said back, and meant everything by it. He kissed her. And this time there was nowhere to be and nothing to interrupt and no reason in the world to be careful about how much was showing. It started soft. A relearning, a return to the beginning of something that had been waiting. And then deepened slowly, the way good things deepened, with patience and intention and the particular warmth of two people who had earned the moment they were in. His hands moved from her face, one sliding into her hair, fingers threading through her blue with a gentleness that made her breath catch in the back of her throat, the other finding the curve of her waist and drawing her closer with a quiet, certain pull that asked nothing and offered everything. She went, willingly, completely. She turned into him on the couch and her hands found his chest again. Not steadying herself this time, not anchoring against adrenaline, but simply wanting to be closer to the warmth and the realness of him. She felt the shift in his breathing against her mouth, the way his hand tightened fractionally at her waist when she moved closer, the low sound in the back of his throat that was restrained and warm and made something in her come entirely undone in the best possible way. He kissed her like she was worth every slow, careful, deliberate second of it. She kissed him back like she finally, fully believed that. When they finally separated. Slowly, reluctantly, his forehead dropping to hers again, and what she was beginning to understand was his specific language. For I'm not ready to be far from you yet. Both of them were breathing differently, and the lamplit room felt warmer than it had, and the world outside had continued on entirely unbothered by the fact that something quietly, permanently significant had just happened on the 4th floor of a Harlem brownstone. "Stay," she said. Not desperate, not a question really. Just honest. Just true. He pulled back enough to look at her face, and what she saw in his eyes was the open, unguarded version of him. No cases, no missions, no weight of 15 years of purposeful grief. Just a man. Present. Choosing. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And she believed him. Not because he was perfect, not because everything was resolved or simple or without the complicated residue of two people who had both been shaped by loss and were learning, carefully, how to let that stop being the whole story. She believed him because she knew how he stood at windows. She knew how he took his coffee. She knew that he ran at 6:45 in the morning, not for fitness, but for the thing you couldn't name, and that he laughed quietly and rarely, and it was devastating when he did, and that he had carried Terrell and Diane in 15 years of forward motion alone, and had, slowly, resistantly, inevitably, put some of it down in her kitchen over cornbread and Malbec and the specific grace of being truly seen. She leaned into him. He wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. Her head against his chest, his chin dropping to rest against her hair, his heartbeat steady and real under her ear. Outside, the saxophone was back. Slow and low and perfectly, absurdly timed, drifting up from the street below like the city was in on it. "That saxophone," she said. "Every single time," he agreed. She laughed. He laughed. And the sound of it. Both of them, together, in the warm lamplight, was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing she had heard in years. Victor Hale was arrested on a Tuesday. It made the news. Briefly, quietly, the kind of story that appeared in paragraph 4 of a financial crimes report, because men like Hale had spent their careers ensuring they would never be front page. But the people who mattered knew. The federal contact called Damon at 8 in the morning with 2 words, "It's done." Damon told Simone across her kitchen counter, 2 mugs between them, morning light coming through the window the way it did now. Familiar and easy, and theirs. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her mug and held it out toward him. He picked up his and touched it to hers. "To Diane," she said. Something moved through his face. Grief and gratitude and the quiet dignity of a loss that had been honored. "To Diane," he said. They drank. Then she set her mug down, reached across the counter and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers the way he always did now. Like it was something worth being deliberate about. "So," she said, "what does Damon Carter do when there's no case to build?" He looked at her steadily. "Apparently he stays in Harlem. Apartment 4A is very small." "It is. 4B has significantly better load distribution, structurally speaking." His mouth did the thing, the almost smile that was warming toward the real one. "Is that an engineering metaphor?" "It's an invitation," she said simply, "if you want it." He looked at her. This woman who had opened her door at midnight without checking the peephole, who had pressed her ear to the wall and made cornbread from scratch and stood down a man with a weapon using a clipboard and her professional credentials, who had offered him partnership when he'd been offering duty and somehow known the difference between the two better than he had. "I want it," he said quietly. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Outside, Harlem moved through a Tuesday morning. Unhurried, unbothered, alive with the ordinary beautiful noise of people building their lives in the full knowledge that nothing was guaranteed and love was worth it anyway. On the 4th floor, in the warm morning light, Simone Clark and Damon Carter sat with their coffee in their intertwined hands and the whole wide-open, unwritten length of what came next. It was, she thought, the best kind of structure. Built slowly, load-bearing, meant to last.